Howdy y'all, and welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Matt.
Howdy, I'm Tim, and we greatly appreciate you watching today's video. Today we're going to answer one of the commonly asked questions that we often have here at Mr. Maple. Today we're talking about the difference between high grafts and low grafts on Japanese maples and on conifers.
We love when you ask questions in the comment section below. Not only does it give us future content, but it helps us better direct our content to answer what you need answered. So that's our goal here, is to give you confidence in growing Japanese maples and maybe to shed some light on some of those horticultural terms or things that may not be common public knowledge. So today we're talking about high graft Japanese maples, low graft Japanese maples, and a little bit more. So we hope this gives you a little bit more insight and can better explain to you what you're looking for so that you can make a better decision overall. I think mainly it comes down to preference. There are high grafts and low grafts in Japanese maples, and it really is just a preference overall, but it's not even that big of a preference because they do get more similar over time.
Yeah, so when we're talking about grafting, we're talking about these cultivars. Check out our video on what is a cultivar, and that'll help you understand a little bit about why we have different selections of Japanese maples, these different breeds of Japanese maples that we do, and we do over 1,000 varieties of those cultivars here at Mr. Maple.
So here I have a high graft garnet, and I'm actually going to hand Tim the low graft garnet here. And you can kind of see an example of these. These are a large 1 gallon. This one is actually grafted at this point right here. So I'll have Tim point out where the low graft is grafted.
The low graft one is grafted right here.
And so you can kind of get an understanding of the difference there. Now there are lots of different reasons why somebody may want a high graft versus a low graft. Nurserymen tend to do high grafts a lot of times because it does give you some more height right away, and it is going to weep down from there. It doesn't necessarily make the Japanese maple a lot faster growing though. It does give it a higher starting point to weep from.
Yeah, and it doesn't affect the long-term size when you have such a small difference in the height at this stage on the grafts. And what it does do is it starts out the high graft at a higher point and the low graft at a lower point. So if you want a smaller growing tree at first, you might want to start out with a lower graft.
Yeah, oftentimes people ask the difference. So one of the quickest ways to get to it is you're going to have more contorted branching down low on that low graft Japanese maple. So with a lace leaf, these are going to make more of that low cascading umbrella shape overall. Garnet is an extremely weeping, small umbrella shape. And so you're going to have more of that contorted, gnarly branching down low and more of the, what makes it more contorted. Now with the high graft, you're going to get that straight trunk. So you're going to get a little bit more of a standard look, and then you're going to start to get that weeping look from there. So if you're going into a bed with hostas or a lot of plants below it, it may be advantageous to start out with a high graft because you already have that elevation to bring that plant up above those other plants.
Yeah, I was told, and I don't know if exactly true, but a high graft, some people believe that was invented by a lot of nurserymen who wanted to be able to field grow and go out with machines or go out and dig up lace leaves later for sale out in the landscape and garden.
It certainly would make sense with a tree spade. You could get around that versus the lower branching.
And then what happened is people became so used to this and found out the advantageous reasons for having a high graft that it became more and more popular in the nursery trade to see a lot of these lace leaf Japanese maples grafted on a higher standard. That's not saying that it's any better. It's something that a lot of people have gotten used to. Now, a low graft is very typical of that photo you see of the Japanese gardens in Portland with those branches that are very, very low, close to the ground, and arching out at a very low point. That's going to give you a lot of area to train and shape the plant as that traditional Japanese style, where I guess this would be a lot more of an American style, is that higher graft.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it does have its advantages in raising it up over your smaller plants. If you're growing heuchera or hosta or small coral, coral belt, things like that you want to have a little bit of separation out. Some people, it varies. Everybody has their own eye for how they want their garden to go. I have some people who are like, I don't ever want my Nabeshidari to be touching the ground. And it may be better for them to start out with a high graft because they're going to get that little bit of elevation. And it's going to look more like what they pictured in their mind for the lace leaf. Where there's other people who want that really contorted branching down low. They want that more traditional style look to it. And so we actually on our website list the differences. I think we're one of the few websites that probably goes through and actually list the differences so you can actually see a high graft and a low graft and select which option's best for you. We like to just give you the best information we can there to make the easiest decision on that.
Yeah, and here we've got another lace leaf. We just talked about garnet.
If you're gonna grab this one, I'll grab the one front here.
This is a high graft. It's grafted right here on a Nabeshidari.
And this low graft is right in here, so very, very low.
So what the difference is between a high graft and a low graft is really you've got a low graft, which is very clear. I mean, it's going to be in that 3 to 4 inch range or lower, and a high graft is anything above that in the height of the graft. This one's grafted about a foot, and then has been staked up and allowed to branch off of that from there.
That's an excellent point. You know, a lot of people graft Japanese maples fairly high. We don't here at our nursery. If it says it's a low graft, they're typically 5 inches or under. You'll see some people that just graft very high overall, even with uprights, and we can get into a little bit of that. Now, an upright Japanese maple really should never be a high graft. So, you know, I'll have people commonly message me on our Facebook app or message Jody, and they'll say, hey, are your blood goods high grafts? Or are your Sengokakus high graft? An upright Japanese maple should never be done as a high graft. High grafts are used to accentuate that weeping characteristic. They're used to accentuate a dwarf characteristic. We've thrown Makawi Etsubusas on them before just to have a fun dwarf up high. But a true upright tree wouldn't have any advantages to being grafted high. It would actually, you know, just kind of look weird because you'd have a bark separation there. So these blood goods are grafted. This one's grafted right in this kind of range.
And this is a Trompenberg, another upright Japanese maple, and it's grafted around this range here. And it makes a lot more sense for an upright to have that low graft. One, because you're going to have the different color in the bark sometimes between the graft and the upper part. And also, it's something to be aware of. These are all grafted trees. So on a high graft Japanese maple, you've got this much that's rootstock. That means down the road, if the plant goes through a stress or a young plant, you may have rootstock trying to grow from below the graft. And we've got the graft marks right here. And on higher grafts, you've got a bigger area that you need to watch and prune off any rootstocks coming off. It's
often important, and I point it out a lot to people, but if you see, and you know, once they're past a certain stage when they're young, you don't tend to get it unless there's damages. But with a Japanese maple, you want to identify where your graft is at when you receive a new tree, and then take anything off below that graft, because what you'll end up with is eventually the rootstock would overtake the graft. Now, a graft is by far the best way to get a Japanese maple. You can watch our whole video on why we graft Japanese maples, but a graft is by far the most superior way to reproduce those traits. But you want to be conscious of that. So we want to give you the best advantages to make your tree look the best long term. If you leave a rootstock on a tree, even an upright long term, it will typically take over. One tends to win.
And it can happen on low grafts as well.
For sure.
But you have a much smaller area that it can grow from. Right here on this one, you've got maybe an inch to the soil line where it might throw off rootstocks. Now, you don't typically get that happen. That doesn't typically happen in the landscape once a plant's established, unless the plant goes through a bad stress like a late frost or something along those lines. But it's something to be aware of, that when you have a higher graft, you need to be more conscious and looking for that to see if there's any rootstock coming out from below the grafted point.
Now let's grab that Sengokaku. Let's talk a little bit about that. This is an upright coral bark. You can point out where it's grafted right there for.
Grafted right down here at the base.
Now, with any of your bark interest types, they should have a very low graft to them. You wouldn't want a high graft coral bark. Again, it's an upright, so all uprights should be lower grafted. And all uprights at our nursery will always be lower grafted unless we have some specific thing we've stated in the description. So look for that. We'll always let you know if it's not. Generally, all of our uprights are going to be low grafts. I say unless we tell you, because we did do those Makawas, which is a dwarf upright on a standard. So sometimes we'll do some fun, you know, like small ball types on a standard. But coral barks are going to have a different color bark than the rootstock. So you want to do those very low so there's not a big amount of separation there.
So any of those colored bark varieties are low grafted, and the reason why is because you would see the difference between the green rootstock and the red on the coral bark. So all those are going to be a low graft. They should be propagated that way here at our nursery, and really should be propagated in most other nurseries that way as well. Now, we wanted to talk to you a little bit too about some conifers and the difference between a high graft and a low graft on some of the conifers. Now, there's actually some uses for conifers that have some high grafts that give them a little bit unique, different shape. We're looking here at Picea glauca pixie dust.
Yeah, so both these are pixie dust, and you can see this one's on a little bit more of a standard. We often, I guess for some reason in conifers, you tend to call it a standard.
Or a lollipop.
Yeah, or a lollipop, and then in maples, it's often called like a high graft. But same terminology, you know, for all intents and purposes, similar reasons and similarly done. This pixie dust just gives it a little bit more elevated height right away. Being an extreme dwarf, you're going to get it a little bit closer up. So, you know, we like to have it as almost like a lollipop shape there in the landscape because you can play around with those textures and get them higher up.
And you notice the plants, the grafts are doing the exact same thing. They're making the exact same shape, but at different points. And the reason being is because it's the same grafted clone, but one's grafted on a standard and one's grafted lower. This gives you different aesthetics out in the garden and landscape, and also gives you a little bit something different on some conifers. Now, this isn't the case with pixie dust, but Matt was mentioning before we were shooting this video that some people actually graft some dwarf conifer types a little bit higher.
Yeah, you get a little bit more airflow around some of the ones that may need that, and it can help a little bit with some funguses if they're getting a little bit more airflow around them. So that's one reason you may want to have conifers on that raised up, elevated high graft. But it's honestly, it all comes down to perspective and what you're trying to accomplish. It comes down to the eye of the beholder here and what you personally prefer. I see situations in which I like a high graft Japanese maple. I see situations in which I like a low graft, and certainly the same can be said for conifers. I see some beautiful reasons to use either in the landscape, and both, when you understand what they are, can be used as tools to help you better garden and to better achieve your overall goal.
One thing to remember is that when we do a high graft and a low graft, it isn't really changing a lot of the height. Here we have an Anab here, and you can stake this up and continue this height up on a low graft as well. The high graft just naturally already has a little bit of height because it's grafted at that higher point.
Yeah.
And so it's not always a height thing, but it's basically a preference to where you want those branches to really start.
Certainly by staking, and we'll probably do a staking video as soon as we get in the spring. Spring's the easiest time to stake because the Japanese maples are the most bendable during that time. The sap's higher, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit more. But certainly staking can get you the same results as a high graft. So you can stake up a central leader. You can kind of create that one standard stalk or straight trunk look. And you know, everybody always wants, some people always want Japanese maples to be perfectly symmetrical. And for them, I think the high graft makes more sense. It just depends on how your mind works. Japanese maples are naturally, especially weeping forms, are going to form more of that low cascading umbrella. But it makes sense more depending on your need in the landscape there as well.
And people always come to us and they say, well, I'm going for a container, should I go for a high graft or a low graft? And really, again, that's preference, because it's all depending on where you want those branches to start out. If you don't want branches to be cascading around the edges of the pot, a high graft may actually be better for you in that spot. But if you have a lower spot that you want something to start out at a lower point, and you want the container's overall height to be shorter, then a low graft makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you're sitting near it, you know, you might want to see the branches down lower, but if it's sitting from a distance, it might be smarter to have a higher graft that makes a larger presence quicker.
Yeah, if you have a container where you're putting a lot of smaller, you know, hens and chicks or succulents or just smaller container plants, you may want to look into that higher graft to elevate that up to give you more of a higher canopy to enjoy some of those smaller plants. So it really just gives you different options. And, you know, we just want to give you more of an understanding so you can better understand this. And we hopefully that gives you the tools to make the decision better for what you're looking for.
We hope this inspires you to get some Japanese maples out in your landscape and garden, gives you some confidence in understanding what high grafts and low grafts are. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and sign up for our weekly emails, because we put out 10 new trees every Tuesday at 10. That's something you'll definitely want to check out.
Hey, let us know in the comments section below whether you like high grafts or low grafts. It's always the beginning of the conversation here. You know, I think any Japanese maple collector is probably going to tell you they have a combination of both. There's always reasons for one or the other in different spots. And you may have a preference, but then you may find a spot where you're looking for the other thing.
And if you're looking for a cultivar, it may only be available in a low graft or a high graft. You may not have that option. Not every tree do we are available to offer an option on high graft versus low graft. So sometimes it's best to get what's in front of you and enjoy the plant.
Right, because they're going to be very similar long term.
Yeah.
You know, it gives you some short term changes, but I think long term you're going to get a very similar aesthetic overall. So thanks for watching. God bless.
And have a great day.